So yeah, so lecture today and on stress and disease chapter, and then tomorrow on your own time you can do these extra credit video reviews. The links are available on the web or on our D2L site already. So either Worried Sick is the older documentary, or the Sapolsky video at University of Illinois at their speaker series. So, right, one more thing. So obviously with the state of like where I'm lining up with my syllabus, if you're trying to kind of do your own planning around when the next exam is, I don't really foresee hitting that exam date. I expect to be about 2 days behind that. So if you're looking at your calendar and you're kind of trying to plan accordingly, the next exam is very unlikely to be like, I just don't see how I can do that and do it in a way that is helpful. So I'm let me just get out my materials right here. So the exam was scheduled for April the 1st. I don't see that happening. It'll happen sometime during week 10. I would think somewhere around April the 7th or the 8th would be the likely exam time.
That's the
Okay.
best kind of April Fool's joke.
Oh, that would be so mean if I was like, oh, April Fools, we're really having it that day. That would win me a lot of fans. I'm sure that would show up on the evaluations at the end of the semester. Dr. Craig, that's not a good kind of funny. So, and it may just be that the exam will be something that I just put out there for you to do. We'll see. But at sometime during the week of the 10th, Wednesday or Thursday that week, I would expect that's where the exam will fall. Make sense, everybody? So please, if you have your syllabus or your day timers that you're using, your calendars, just kind of adjust accordingly. And I'll try and stay on top of that in terms of giving you all some visibility. So James, yeah, and if you are away during that period, then just like you do, you're very good at communicating. So just do. Make sense? All right. Okay, everybody. Any questions before we get rolling? I had a good time with you guys yesterday in class, by the way. I thought that was fun. Dr. Guignard does not just pop by my house, by the way, and hang out with me all the time either, right? So he was just, sometimes I have, like, we borrow stuff from each other. So he comes over and needs something from me. So he'll just pop by here and there. So he was like worried that he interrupted our lecture. It's like, I think it's okay, right? But we do ride bikes a lot together, outside, of course, these days. But yeah, so what was funny is another friend of mine from the area was like, oh, is Jimmy up there? And he showed up right after Jimmy. Like, it's like, I don't know what's happening. Party at my house, apparently, that didn't last. Okay, so let's do this thing. If you guys don't have any pressing questions, get this set up. You know, this always takes a minute or two to make this work, but we can do it. Right. So I guess in the last day, I don't know if you guys have Mac devices, but there's been a series of updates for Mac devices. And the old way of like doing air mirroring, which is what I use for this class, to put stuff on this, to take stuff on my iPad and put it up on the screen for you all, just totally changed all the buttons. And screen mirroring, that's what they call it. So let's see if it's letting me do this now. I just found, oh, All right. Screen mirror. Y'all. Changed everything on me. That's so weird. It has changed since my class this morning. Okay. Okay, this should do it. Okay, all better, everybody. I believe. Bless somebody out there. Boom. Okay. Okay, this was the mess I made before we left. Not that. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we're dealing with the issue of stress and how and what the research looks like in terms of its relationship to either contributing or to causing, right? Influencing or actually serving as a direct cause for cardiovascular disease. And what are some of the potential mechanisms involved? So we started looking at the big one, right? The issue of heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, MIs. Let's do that with a different color. An MI, which means myocardial infarction. It's the technical term for the heart attack. And there's a good amount of research showing that there's a variety of different ways of looking at stress, right? So stress has been looked at from different angles. We know this from research methods too, that sometimes we'll operationally define our dependent measures in multiple different ways, because when we say, what is stress? When we operationally define, we always have to get so narrow. So one way to overcome that narrowness is to look at stress from different operational definitions. We can look at it from the point of view of a life event. We can look at it from here. I'll do it this way. We can look at specific kinds of conditions that would be considered to be stressful, either because of just the life change itself or because of how we cognitively respond to it. So several of these conditions appear to be particularly important in communicating risk for MI, and that risk is it's not a small one, as we know from Interheart, right? Depression and just simple perception of the level of stress in one's life, collectively speaking, carry a great amount of weight in terms of increased risk levels. Or we can talk about it in terms of how we perhaps most think about stress as an emotional event, right? An event that carries a physicality to it, but it's distinctly psychological as well, right? Stress, I don't know, I'm just stressed, right, Michaela? So that's like the Michaela blow up, where she's like, ah, like that kind of stress, there's a physicality to it, but it's also distinctly psychological. And we can just kind of collectively say there's kind of the negative emotionality, and especially negative emotionalities associated with the topics of sadness and anger. While this is not specifically reported in the book, it's alluded to. And we find that those can act as triggering events. There could be a diathesis there, meaning, Nathan, what's a diathesis? Another word for that?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, look at your notes and cheat. Who can cheat the fastest? What's a
Vulnerability.
a vulnerability, right? Or a predisposition. So it could be that, you know, a diathesis has to be there already for those triggering situations to create this real negative outcome, cardiovascularly speaking. You know, like I said, though, at the end of the last class, what's kind of frightening about this area is somewhere around 50% of the cases of heart attacks, fatal or non-fatal, do not have any particular risks. The people that are having them are not at higher risk. They don't have clogged arteries. They don't, you know, what we're seeing is an electrical abnormality that leads their heart to beat wrong. And that's why this point, I think, is really kind of important, right? Because it communicates that stress can have its effects even on people for which that diathesis may not be present. Okay, kind of frightening, right? But certainly if we're compromised, it's going to be even more so. Well, your text spends a little time dealing with this, or talking about this question of reactivity, right? Reactivity. And in other words, how we physiologically react to those moments or extensions of stressful moments in our life. So cardiovascular reactivity, let me go to my pen here. I'll go to red to be consistent. Collectively means our cardiovascular responses to stressors. There's different ways of looking at reactivity. Increase that just a little bit here. There's different ways of looking at reactivity, you know, like magnitude of increase, just how large the increases are. Time above baseline, or the old concept of homeostasis, how long we stay in a reactive state, you know, or duration issue. It's even like, this is actually a little bit different. Sometimes they use the term recovery as well. How long it takes once the stressful situation is abated, how long it takes for us to return back to a resting state. All of those have been studied, right? What we can say, and this is kind of interesting because it's often kind of presumed that people that are overreactive, physiologically speaking, are somehow at greater risk. In fact, what we find is that's not exactly true. While it is true that we all react in different ways, it's a fairly stable response pattern in most people. In other words, Aaron, there's kind of a range for how you react, right? And you're probably fairly consistent with it, regardless of the type of stressor that you are placed with or confronted with in your life. Your, say, cardiovascular response is fairly predictable in terms of how much of a reaction you're going to give. So in that sense, is Meadow there? I don't even see do I get a hand? Thank you, Meadow. So in that sense, it almost has this kind of dispositional quality, right? When I use the word dispositional, sometimes that's used in a discussion of what we call, or, of personality topics. Dispositional meaning a fairly stable response pattern. So regardless of who I'm talking about, some people are dispositionally more reactive. Who took my stress management course? Okay, a few of you all have. We talked about in stress management hot reactors. I don't know if you remember that term, hot reactors. These are people that react in excessive disproportion to the risk. That tends to be a fairly stable response pattern. The question is does that short-term stable response pattern, if it's a short-term one, carry risk? What we find is that the risk for excessive reactivity patterns cardiovascularly in terms of development of cardiovascular disease tends to show up in one group. And that's at people that are already at high risk. What's that mean? It means they've got a family history. They have existing cardiovascular disease. They have existing hypertension. For these populations that are already at some increased risk, there is evidence that cardiovascular reactivity can carry some kind of causal, additional causal risk. However, with normals, like Cora, if you have no family history of cardiovascular disease or hypertension, right? You don't have any existing. You just happen to be kind of somebody that reacts really vigorously. Your risk is actually no different than anybody else's. That's what the current evidence shows. So the risk seems to, here's that kind of diathesis stress model. It matters if there is an existing vulnerability. It doesn't seem to matter if that vulnerability does not exist. So we saw that in the discussion of ulcers as well in that video, right? So for a long time, stress was thought to be purely, that ulcers were psychogenic, in that stress had a direct causal relationship with it, right? They talked about the doctors, Sapolsky's talking about, oh, these doctors are going to have to actually talk to patients about their feelings and where they're at. And then everybody was so relieved because they found like that there was this bacteria in the system that had to be there in order for ulcers to develop, right? So there had to be a diathesis there, right? And so all the doctors were like, thank God, right? That we don't have to talk to people about their feelings anymore. So he was being a little tongue in cheek about it. But as we find out that somewhere between, 2/3 to as much as, 85% of people actually have that bacteria in their gut already. So, it almost makes it a moot point, except for 15% of people that don't have it. The diathesis doesn't exist. Okay, so it's another situation where we can talk about the diathesis stress model. And at the end of last class, we're kind of looking at some of these charts about what does cardiovascular reactivity look like. So I was sharing this with you, and this is what it looks like. And what's beautiful about this chart is you get to really see the collection of about 200 people's bodies kind of regressed onto a single line here. Right? So here's everybody at minute 1. They've been hooked up, sitting for a minute, uncrossed legs, sitting quietly, and they're up here already starting at around 75 millimeters of mercury diastolic blood pressure. What do you think's happening that they're highest here to start with? I mean, you might need to put yourself in their place to kind of think about it, Danny. But why would they start off so high?
Depending on like the risk factors they're facing, like they could be in like have high blood pressure and start off naturally, or like having their legs crossed, like something simple like that.
Okay, so it could be that maybe they weren't prepped. They were, I'm pretty methodical about those kinds of things. But just think, these are kids that in many cases were just running from class, or they're people that don't know me. They don't know what I'm going to do, right? They're like, what am I doing in this weird lab getting my blood pressure? So there's probably some anticipatory anxiety that's involved there. And they figure out over time, they just sit quietly, and over the course of 10 minutes, they drop a full 10 millimeters of mercury down to around 65 or so. And it would probably drop, if I did this out at 20 minutes, probably drop another couple more, right? So we very rarely have 10 minutes where we just sit quietly and our whole job is to do nothing, right? So we get them down to a measure of rest. And then I apply the first kind of anticipatory stressor, right? They have to come up with an argument, or they have to describe a time in which somebody has accused them of something that they did not do and they were upset about it. And then they have to create an argument that they would use to defend themselves, right? So they're kind of thinking about this, knowing that they're thinking about this, and boom, look at how reactive that goes from minute 10 here to minute 11 here. They shoot right past their initial base point. This is a little excessive, isn't it? They're just sitting quietly thinking about a cognitive task. Here we can see the mind-body interactions of reactivity. The question that your text is posing to you is, does this represent a risk for cardiovascular disease? Here's a very clear stress response being governed through cognitive stressors, right? An interpretive process. We're thinking or reflecting back on a time in which we've experienced some kind of harm or threat. And boom, we respond fairly vigorously. But also look what happens as over the course of several minutes, as they're doing it, you have the body saying, okay, that's a bit too much. That's a bit too much. So the body's trying to make these healthy adaptations. Here's allostasis at work, right? Allostasis is a process by which the body's trying to say, let's give you just the right amount, just like your car, right? Like if you hit the gas too much, the engine might rev for a minute and then bring it back down to a level that conserves gasoline a little bit. Maybe it uses a little computerized brain to do that. Well, we don't have a computerized brain. We have a real brain, right? And there it is saying, let's not go too far. It's still above that baseline. They're still just sitting, right? They're not talking to anybody. They're just sitting and thinking about it, right? But you see the body saying, let's not use too much here. Is this risky? Right? And then they have to talk. When they talk, boom, not only do they go up, but for the duration of the period of talking, they stay elevated, right? The body is not very successful at bringing them back down much. And then as soon as they're done, boom, there they go. But notice they don't drop all the way back to baseline. It's not a full recovery. Even 10 minutes out, they're still above that old baseline. So I'm just walking you through this because these are the questions that scientists have wondered. Does the lack of recovery matter? There are some people that, this is a collective, so that there are some people in this that did drop down to baseline. But that means that there's a bunch of people that are much more elevated over here. Are they at risk because their bodies don't come down as fast? Well, are these ones that go up really high? And there were people, right? This is the collective. There were people up here, no doubt. Are they at greater risk? So the answer, the best we understand, Alexis, so I assume you're there. I can't quite see you, but I can tell that the camera's moving, so there must be a person there. what the research tells us is as long as we don't have some existing diathesis, some existing vulnerability, all of those seem to be not communicative of any great risk to us. If we do, though, it does carry some meaningful risk associated with it. So it really does matter for people that come from family histories where cardiovascular disease is an issue, where they have already high blood pressure, where they have, somebody's already had a heart attack. This matters, okay? It's also one of the reasons why a lot of doctors will medicate, okay? They're gonna manage not only kind of steady levels of pressure, but they wanna manage big changes that happen too quick, right? It's not really healthy for any system to experience that. So what are the kinds of conditions that have been attached to reactivity? Well, it's, consistent with that idea of hot reactors. It's been found that people that you'll see this, if you choose to do the older video, Worried Sick, you'll see Redford Williams doing some work down in North Carolina with people that are and comparing people's differences that are kind of high hostile, low hostile. And you'll see that reactivity tends to be greater in high hostile individuals. Not surprising. What's hostile mean? It means there's a deep distrust. They kind of see people as trying to get over on them all the time. We may sometimes feel like that periodically, but there are people that are dispositionally that way. They're just distrustful of others, and they question their intentions. If you wonder whether that's you, a quick test of that. Well, you actually took the inventory. You probably know since you've done the scoring. But just as a reminder, a quick test is if somebody unexpectedly gives you a gift, do you feel thankful and happy about it, or do you wonder what they're trying to get from you? Right? If you're in the second case, you got a little bit more hostility to you. Like, what do they want? Why are they being so nice to me? Right? If that's where you're at, okay, you got a little bit of that dispositionally. Okay. We do see that men tend to be more reactive generally than women, right? On average. It doesn't mean that it applies necessarily to you in particular, but on average, we see that. And there is African-American populations tend to be more reactive, cardiovascularly speaking, than do other racial categories. The last is this interesting issue, and that by the way, tends to be independent of what I'm about to bring up, which is the topic of stereotype threat. So there's been some really interesting research, and one was from a guy that was my roommate for several conferences when I was in graduate school. I just met him, and he was just a super nice guy. So we roomed at a couple of behavioral medicine conferences where we were presenting research. His name's Marcellus Merritt, and really interesting guy that was very interested in doing work. I think he was at Howard University at the time. Anyway, but cool guy. This is not his research. This is just some research that I had available to me and I thought was communicative of what can happen. So we were going over this at the end of the last class. So I have status, verbal communication, and blood pressure, right? So we're looking at reactivity in participants, moving from quiet settings, kind of like we were here, to settings in which they are talking and perhaps feeling evaluated. So these are kids reading. And I don't know if you remember your own experiences from grade school, but reading out loud, right? When you're learning to read, it can be kind of anxiety provoking, especially if there's somebody like your teacher's watching you or something like that. Does anybody kind of loosely remember that? Like you'd have to read a passage out loud and you're still kind of learning to read. It's a little horrifying, right? So what they did is they looked at these groups and they had them read to people that were of equal status, like to their peers, or they had them read to somebody that was perceived to be as higher status, judgmental towards them, right? And what you can see here for systolic and diastolic, when these kids read to people that were of higher status, when they read to peers, same passages, exact same mechanical activity, right? Just reading out loud. Yet when status is introduced, when there is some sense of there could be some kind of somebody may be looking down at me, all right? Which is what we're doing with this study. We see a totally different condition, right? So to the degree that certain populations feel that they are chronically in situations where others may be looking down at them, which can be a stereotype, which is what we would call something like a stereotype threat. Just the daily activities that many others of us may take for granted, their bodies can be affected remarkably differently. And it is the explanation for why, at least one of the explanations for why we see some disparities in groups that are in lower socioeconomic status groups, which include, collectively speaking, some of the phenomena we see with African-American populations, but it's not unique to them, all right? So this is stereotype threat, but stereotype threat and socioeconomic status go together, right? We're even using the term status, right? Communicating some people being of higher or lower levels on the ladder, so to speak. Make sense? Okay. So in kind of summation, cardiovascular reactivity may act causally for those under severe psychological stress, especially if a diathesis is present. There is like this other kind of, I don't have a chart for this, but there is this phenomena that under very severe situations, it can definitely trigger some changes that can create problems. The classic, I don't know whether you all have kind of followed this or it's kind of made its way into your awareness, but over the last few years, there's been a lot more attention to the concept of the broken heart, right? The idea that the intense loneliness, intense change, separation from others can have really profound cardiovascular events, especially those severe kinds of changes. This is what I'm talking about, all right? It's not a new idea. We know the term, oh, my heart is so broken. That goes back a long way, and the research of that goes back a long way. But as they're doing more MRI research, like this guy right there did a lot of the work in this area actually in the 70s, early kind of exploration into the idea that intense loneliness can kill us. They've done more recent stuff using MRI machines at Hopkins showing that those people that are intensely lonely build up fats in their arteries a lot faster than people that don't. Okay, so those kinds of conditions where we can see more severe responses show up. Okay, so I've thrown this term cardiovascular disease around quite a bit. Let me just be really clear with what that means. Cardiovascular disease just means all forms of heart and vascular disease. There's lots of different kinds. The clearest link between stress and cardiovascular disease is the stress hypertension relationship. So hypertension is just the clinical term for high blood pressure. Okay, we did this the other day in class. We know that the determination for high blood pressure, the earliest, we can talk about pre-hypertensions, but hypertensions as a diagnostic condition tends to start somewhere around 140 systolic and around 90 diastolic, right? That's the old level for what we call borderline hypertension, but they've become a little bit more aggressive in determining that even at these kinds of levels, significant clinical risks exist. And it's important because while sometimes it's called the silent killer, I know that's kind of dramatic. It's sometimes called the silent killer because we really don't feel our blood pressure, yet it is a major predictor for more severe forms of cardiovascular disease developing, right? It could be in the vascular areas, or it can be coronary heart disease, buildup of fats and plaques in the arteries. And we know for certain that stress, in the very least, can cause temporary hypertension, okay? Temporary being anywhere from minutes to days or weeks, okay, depending on the nature of the stress. In fact, before we had medication for hypertension, the treatment for it, James, so this is interesting given the amount of time you're spending in hospitals or around them these days. The old treatment for hypertension was quarantining. Doesn't that sound, it sounds like it's not that you're at risk to give it to somebody else, but what happens in quarantine? Nothing happens, right? You're like off doing your own thing away, separated from everybody else. So the way in which hypertension was often managed was people were put in a quiet part of a hospital, away from everybody else, separated from their daily kind of routine. And more often than not, after a week or so, often pressures return to normal levels. Right? Isn't that wild? Of course, we don't usually get, and then people go back to their normal lives, and guess what happens? Whoop, right? Goes back up. But it tells you a little bit about the nature of how the long-term stress responses might work, right? When we are able to recover, our bodies are often built to do that. So usually when stress is removed, let me go to my button here. Usually when the stress is removed, blood pressure tends to fall. We saw that up here too, didn't we? Stress got removed, it falls, not right away, but slowly. It might stay elevated for a little while. It's just like you guys at the end of your semesters, you stay a little elevated. That's true of blood pressure too, right? Probably your blood pressure does stay elevated. In all likelihood, after me talking with you all for an hour and 15 minutes, my pressure stays elevated for a half an hour or so. You know, that's just, I am engaging in a long, like an exercise here that's physical in nature, and talking will make those changes. So the long term, however, connecting hypertension and stress may be moderated through sodium pathway. Well, the distribution of sodium in the system. So one of the responses of the body during the resistance phase of the stress experience, right? For a long-term stress. So remember what resistance phase is, right? The resistance phase is not the fight flight, but the phase in which the longer term stress response kicks in, that is glandular in nature, right? Which allows us to stay up for longer periods of time. Well, the body is trying to use multiple mechanisms to allow us to stay in a state of preparedness. One of the ways that the body does that is it releases substances so that we retain sodium in the system, salt, right? Danny, what happens if you pour a little bit of water on some salt? Or another way to ask, you can answer either one of these. If you're a hunter, why have historically some hunters salt cured meats? Answer either one. It, well, you can, I could ask you this too. What happens if you pour salt on a slug?
The slug like explodes.
No, the opposite.
It melts?
Well, it doesn't melt. It pulls all the water out of the slug,
Right.
right? I don't, is that, okay, so it shrinks. It'll actually get like, it'll implode kind of, I suppose, as a matter of speaking. It's the same thing as, you know, hunters or people that work, butchers, salt curing meats, right? It pulls the moisture out and allows that to, it's a way of preserving, right? And salt is a preservative because it removes fluid from it, right? So what happens if we pull, it removes fluid by pulling that fluid out, right? And the salt becomes kind of this mushy stuff, kind of like the salt on your driveway during the winter or something like that. So if we have more sodium in our system, in our circulatory system, it's inside us now. So it's not on the outside. Fluid's not getting pulled to the outside. We've got salt on the inside. What do you think happens to our circulatory system if we're holding more sodium in it? What does it pull into it? Michaela, do you remember from stress management? Well, it's just going to pull the moisture into the circulatory system, right? We now have more salt in a closed system. It's going to start putting more fluid in that closed system. What happens in your at home? You know, maybe you have a water tank or something like that for your shower, right? I assume that you do. What happens if you jam twice the amount of water in the same size tank? You can do it. You're going to jack the pressure in your water system big time, right? That's what's happening in our bodies. So it's presumed that in these long-term stress responses, here's the body saying we need to maintain pressure to perfuse muscles that might need to be active in a quick fashion. So we're going to maintain higher levels of pressure, and the body does that by bringing salt into the circulatory system, raising pressure. But Nathan, do we really need to have pressure raised like that just to read out loud or to do a lecture in class or to do your schoolwork? No, it's excessive. But our body is not built for that kind of symbolic stressor, anticipatory stressor. It's built for us avoiding being chased by the tiger. You know, maybe back in caveman days when we were being chased by saber-toothed tigers. This is how our body is built. We haven't yet evolved to a point where there's distinctions in response for people that are dealing with a symbolic versus a true physical threat. All right. So stress leads to the retaining of sodium, therefore elevating blood pressure. Why? Because sodium increases water retention within the cardiovascular system. All right. So this is how perhaps those pathways with hypertension may be moderated. So far, so good, everybody? Everybody following along? Meadow, how you doing there? Thank you, Meadow. All right. Other pathways may be more indirect, just a couple of points here to kind of finish up on this. One indirect pathway, well, people that are stressed behave differently than people that are not stressed. They make different choices. And some of those choices may be choices in terms of the health behaviors that they engage on. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I get really stressed, chips sure are tasty. You know what I mean? You know, there are other people, they might not be, you know, a Dorito Cool Rancher when they're stressed, but no quart of ice cream is safe in their freezer, right? It is their comfort food. We actually call it comfort food, don't we? Which it presumes that we are in a state of discomfort and we seek it because it leads us to be, oh, less stressed, right? So one of the indirect behaviors by which, or paths by which stress may affect, is we make poor health choices, show poor or more risky behaviors when we are in long-term stress conditions. People are more likely to smoke, they're more likely to engage in violent or risky behavior, more likely to abuse substances, especially drug use in to drink and abuse drugs. It is particularly more likely among males. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen with females. It just means on average, if you had to like roll the dice and say who is more likely to do it, guys are more likely to abuse substances when stressed than are women, but both do. And then women are more likely on average to make poor eating choices during stress. Other kinds of paths, this was specifically talked about with the Whitehall studies in the video that we watched the other day in class. That guy that was, a lot of that was about hierarchy and where you are on a socioeconomic ladder. And if you remember the guy, the English guy that was kind of a little lower on the level, talked about, you know, he was basically being put upon, his boss was heaping on him, you know, and his life was tough. And then there was somebody else that was upper level and she had a lot more flexibility and control over her life. This phenomena your book describes as kind of a job strain. Job strain is a term that describes imbalances in demand, control relationships. Okay, when I mean imbalances, I mean that, think about this as high demand, low control. Okay, those kinds of dichotomies, right? Generally speaking, you know, there are people with very high demand jobs. Think about your surgeon or your physician, or I don't know. There are lots of people that are in high demand positions, but they also have tremendous control over their lives, right? Those people can often set their schedules, right? They can choose whether they're going to see this patient or that patient some of the time, right? They have good control. We don't see the same kind of stress responses in people that are high demand, but also have high control. The classic job strain candidate is that person that is lower on the ladder, so to speak, that can be issued a lot of work, yet have very little control over their say of how that gets done, when it gets done, and so forth. So within a work context, we see that people that have this imbalance between one side and the other are more likely to suffer cardiovascular disease. And that's what all those studies we're talking about that were collectively called the Whitehall studies in the video we watched the other day. What we also know is that if we introduce another variable, kind of collective variables related to social support, that there is a synergistic relationship. In other words, if you have situations where you have good social network strength, in other words, you're plugged into your community, to your families, and so forth. If that's a good, strong relationship, or you have or people that are in job strain, but they have really good partner support, they're in their close relationships, we find those those conditions attenuate job strain. So think about it, like, to make this concrete for you. uh, um, somebody is a secretary, classic group that has high demand, low control, right? Secretaries always are working for somebody else. And often for lots of other people, they're given lots of work. And usually that work needs to be done like ASAP. And they don't have a lot of room to say, maybe not today, I'm not feeling it. Or, they don't have that group. So a lot of job strain in that category. But if they're connected to their family, if the culture of their job is one that is supportive, if they have a partner at home that is supportive of them, and part of the issue is kind of these dual role relationships that you sometimes see. If you have that, we see that job strain does not have the same kind of effect, negative effect. Okay, so we see that from research like that generally speaking, the role of social support, we talk about this as a buffer between those stress and disease processes. So it gets in the middle and mutes the effect of stressful situations, allows people to sustain them and not suffer harm as a result of them. So far, so good, everybody? Okay. Well, I think that I'm going to do this. Well, we'll see where I go with this. I have multiple things going on in my head as usual, all kinds of voices talking to me. So, yeah. Okay, so there's quite a bit going on this slide, and I know some of you all like to write this down. So we'll do this slowly. Let's just do it bit by bit. We'll start here with diabetes. So there's two different forms of diabetes. Both of them have been studied in relation to the stress question of whether that diabetes can be caused or aggravated by stress. One kind of diabetes is childhood diabetes. IDDM just means insulin dependent diabetes, right? Kids that were born without the ability to make their own insulin. Think about insulin as a little vehicle that moves sugar into muscles. Okay, so we know we need glucose in order to make our muscles fire and things like that. Insulin acts by taking that sugar from the bloodstream that we know that we produce when we're stressed or when we eat, and moving that to the working muscles. Danny, this is why your coaches sometimes, after like a cardiovascular workout of some kind, will say, you need to eat right after you exercise, right? You need to go eat something. Why? Because for a short period of time, the muscles are a lot more open to having that insulin take the sugars into those working muscles. It's actually called the glycogen window, not for the test, but that is the case. So some people don't make that stuff. So then they have to get, these are the people that need to get their insulin injections. They've been in the news a lot because of the cost of insulin for people. Is there any diabetics in here? Anybody diabetic? Meadow, so this is you? Do you have to take a shot?
I have an insulin pump.
Okay, so you have a pump. So you don't have to, you're just always online.
Yeah.
Basically, right. I have one of my nephews, same thing, has that same thing. So, Meadow does not produce this substance. It's just kind of how, we all get our different quirks of development. And this is how, hey, who's that, James?
One of the sergeants for my unit.
Yeah? You want to attend class?
He was just coming over to see what I was doing.
All right. So anyway, so it's always fun to see like the action in the background. during Zoom. It's a totally different experience, isn't it? So anyway, so there is a second form, which we used to call adult onset diabetes. We don't really call it that anymore because so many kids are what we would call non-insulin dependent diabetes, right? In other words, they produce insulin, but because of certain cases, this is very strongly associated with obesity. They don't produce enough, or they have difficulty having that insulin move to the muscles. There's a resistance to that process. So in both cases, whether it be the case like Meadows' situation or a case that is more common, this non-insulin dependent diabetes, in both cases, it's important to be able, like I'm sure Meadow, that you have activities, you have to be very thoughtful about when you eat, what you eat, you have to be prepared. Like if you start feeling like you're not getting sugar in your system, like you have to be prepared to make some changes, right? There's a lot of attention to behavioral responses for this condition, for either of these conditions. And people, so when we look at them specifically, there's really not a lot of research that suggests stress causes either of the diabetic situations. So the effect of stress for diabetes appears to be largely indirect. That is, the condition can be aggravated. It can be made worse as a result of people being in stress states. What it tends to do is stress affects. Can you read that, or is that just way too sloppy? Okay, Danny, that face tells me, let me do better. Whoa. It affects the management. I kind of ran out of room here. And onset of the condition. Okay, so understand that this is just a variation on what we talked about with the indirect behaviors related stress and cardiovascular disease. When people are stressed, some of the choices that they make, the riskiness of their behavior can change. If the stress, if it's kind of a depressive type stress, then, I mean, the term depression refers to a lack of something, right? The absence of something, and that includes the absence of effective behaviors. So stress may affect the management of the condition, but not, right, the cause of it. So stress is, in terms that we have talked about previously in class, stress leads to issues with adherence or health-seeking behaviors, right? Remember this from the previous class. So, do you mind, Meadow, mentioning, like, what are the kinds of things that, like, your physician, your healthcare provider says to you in terms of what you need to pay attention to?
So there is different symptoms if you're high and low.
Yeah.
To pay attention to those. I do not really have symptoms when I'm high, but I'll have them if I drop low enough.
Yeah.
I also have a continuous meter as well, so I don't have to finger prick and test as frequently.
Right. Does your physician still talk to you about the regularity of, like, your eating schedules and things like that? Or
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, that's a big issue with people that have either kind of diabetes, is the regularity of their eating schedules and the kinds of things that they eat. They want kind of a more even, what they would call low on the glycemic index. They don't want to see, like, big changes in sugar levels in the system as a result of diet. So those things need to be paid attention to by either group. With the group that is different from your condition, the non-insulin dependent group, the use of exercise and physical activity is also really important. Like, I don't know how much that is an issue for you, Meadow, but for them, they need to do that because of what we were talking about with Danny, that opening of the glycogen window. They can use exercise in a way that shortly after exercise, they can eat and move that material, those sugars, into their system easier than they would at any other point in the day. So the inclusion of regular exercise and appropriate diet afterwards, much of this can be regulated behaviorally. But you know, how good are you guys with adhering to regular exercise and good diet? It's hard, right? And it's hard even when you're not stressed, much less when you are. Okay. We also, you know, the research on asthma is a little bit clearer, and it is that asthma actually does appear to have a psychogenic basis. In other words, asthmatic responses can be caused by stressful situations, right? If you know, like I have asthma, I'm not saying I have asthma because I'm stressed, right? What I'm saying is that asthmatic responses can be the product or triggered by stressful situations. All right. So there is a good amount of historical research that asthma is psychogenic. Some asthmas are psychogenic, and emotional events can absolutely trigger those attacks. We can look at people that grow up in environments that have been more stressful. This isn't mentioned in the book. I wish it was. It was mentioned in a previous version because it's really interesting research. But children that were significantly bullied when they were younger at like 4 times increased risk for development of asthma later on in life. We know that kids that grow up in inner city environments that are more impoverished also have significantly more increased risk of asthma development. It is an issue. It is a disparity issue that exists in our country right now. The number of inner city kids that are asthmatic, lots of them are relative to kids that grow up in rural environments or in environments that are suburban. Some of that is a product of the acute stress that occurs among individuals on lower socioeconomic status. The stress in those people's lives are incredible, right? Hard to appreciate if you have not been in that situation. You know, it just makes me think, like, and you probably, some of you all know people. If it's not you, you probably know people that are in those situations. And it's something else what people deal with. And then also, and this is, you know, these can go together, kids that grow up in environments in which they have parents or a parent that has more severe mental health problems, they're far more likely. So all of these environments are kind of existing stressful situations that are long-term and chronic, but those are associated with much increased risk. But we also know that short-term events can also make a difference. I'm going to finish up with rheumatoid arthritis quickly, and then we're going to be done for today. So rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases means that the immune system affects us, right? In other words, our own immune system that's designed to protect us sees parts of our body or substances within our body as foreign and attacks it. In the case of rheumatoid arthritis, it attacks joint structure in the body. So, and you see intense inflammation and pain at the level of the joints, often the hands. So it is the function of an overactive immune system that's having a hard time identifying the difference between a foreign invader in our system and our own system. Okay, so what the research suggests is like what we saw with diabetes earlier, we find that the effects are indirect or secondary, is a term that's used in your text. People that are stressed, their behaviors, their ability to cope with the pain is worse. It is very strongly related to the degree of pain sensitivity that they have. When we are more stressed, our sensations of pain are increased. We think about pain as something purely physical. It is distinctly psychological, right? And we know that because there's times where we may suffer something that might hurt quite a bit, but we don't feel it right away till later because we're so occupied with something intensely going on right now, right? Ask somebody that, in a game or in some other kind of intense event, we may not really feel the pain we may not feel the pain of an injury until after the game is over. Okay, so it's an interesting quality of pain. Nothing to me seems more real and more physical to me than pain. Yet what's very interesting about pain is there are philosophers, I think, that are wrong, but they will argue that pain actually is purely a psychological event. I don't believe that, right? But the idea that it is not strongly influenced by our psychology is very clearly would be an incorrect idea, right? It is, our psychology matters a lot. And what we find is that when we're stressed, we're a lot more sensitive to pain. And that's true of individuals that have conditions that are very painful, like rheumatoid arthritis. So they talk about in the text, I think, that on certain days of the week that tend to be more stressful, people with rheumatoid arthritis report much higher levels of pain than, say, like weekends or holidays, something like that. There is some evidence use the term here. Oops. Danny, that says general dysregulation. All right. So there is some evidence that stress can create some dysregulation. In other words, it's not operating as either rhythmic or efficient manner when we are in stressed situations. And that may lead to some difficulty with the issue of surveillance in the immune system. Remember that rheumatoid arthritis is a surveillance issue. James, what I mean by that, and when we go through, I'm talking about you right now because I can see a military uniform in the background. But when we talk about the immune system, it's very easy to think about it in military terms, right? There are parts of the military whose whole job is not necessarily to do the active tip of the spear fighting, but to identify. They go out and scout, right? And say, here's where the action is and what you need to do to prepare for it. Well, for people with rheumatoid arthritis, the part of the immune system that is designed to go out and say, here's where the invaders are in our bodies that shouldn't be there, it doesn't work right. It says, hey, there's an invader, but it's really part of their own bodies, right? So when we are stressed, there is some evidence that the agents responsible for the surveillance process don't work very well. Okay, so this is what I mean. There may be a link between the neuroendocrine system, the long-term stress response, and the effectiveness of the immune surveillance process. Okay, we are headed into a discussion of stress and immune and immune research. If you want to kind of grab the notes ahead of time and look at some interesting charts, I've got a few to share with you coming up. But this is where we will start for the next formal class, which will be for Cora's Bun on Tuesday. Okay, so I will set up that other extra credit assignment for you all tomorrow. I'll set it up for you tomorrow. You'll have through, I don't know, we'll say just till next Wednesday to get it done, if you choose to do it. If there are questions, I'll take them now. If not, see you later.